Hi, Amy, and welcome. I'm so glad you could be here.
Thank you. I'm so excited.
So, tell us a bit about your piece, kind of how it came to be, where it started, and what your process was.
Yeah, this is a special piece to me because I think I've been writing it in one form or another since 2013. It started as a poem. It's one of those experiences that's so strange and that's so surreal that I had to enter it that way first. And it's only been in the last 3 or 4 years that I've started to translate it into creative nonfiction. So I was really excited it found a home with Bellevue.
So, I'm curious. So, when you started as a poem, what made it be a poem at that moment?
Yeah, it was that experience of being tested for the tapeworm itself. It was just a maybe 10-line poem, kind of imagining what it would be like to have that extracted from me, if that was even possible. Because the whole experience felt so surreal. It felt like a poem was a good entryway into that moment and into that feeling. And I think I needed more emotional distance from it to actually write it into a real narrative, into real nonfiction.
We just heard from Salim. He talked about his definition of a poem is a truth, finding the truth. So, I find it fascinating that you sort of saw that as the first sort of manifestation of this truth of your story.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, what is the process of converting a poem to a nonfiction essay?
Oh, many years, many years, a lot of distance. I actually exchanged an earlier draft with my father, who was there with me on that day of that appointment. And it was almost just as an affirmation to even myself that it was real and that was something that we actually experienced together. But it was a very elliptical piece. It took me a long time to realize that it was much more about my relationship with doctors and with the medical industry in general, and not just about that one moment. And kind of reflecting on these different micro experiences I've had in doctors' offices and gynecology offices ever since then.
It's so interesting because I'm a primary care doctor, so I spend lots of times in those offices and often write about it as well. And it's always interesting to find the other side of it. And I've often wanted to do a sort of a pairing. If you could have one of your doctors write about the experience, what do you think they would write about? Where their observation on the other side of the test.
Oh, I would love to know. That would be completely fascinating to me. I've had good experiences with doctors too, but I think that so quickly the doctors I've had hear that I've had an eating disorder, and there's an assumption of she's neurotic, she's prone to control. And I wish there was more focus on the lived experience of it, as opposed to thinking through that etiology and thinking through almost like what was wrong with me. I feel like it almost jumps to that before it's just backtracking and letting me tell my story. And I do wonder what that primary care physician I had, would have said on that day. And I often reflect and think that she would, defer to my parents wanting that test done, and kind of the denial that went into that. I wonder if she would remember it all, and if she would have done the same thing today.
Right. Well, as Anatoly Broyard once wrote, in his experience with going to doctors for his prostate cancer, that for his doctor, he's just one patient on the rounds, but for him, it's the crisis of his life. And you're right, maybe that doctor doesn't even remember the one of the 50 patients she saw that day. And it also points to the importance about narrative medicine. Galen, the fiction winners, is involved in the narrative medicine program at Columbia. And many of us hope that these sorts of programs do give doctors and nurses and physical therapists a chance to think about, beyond just the facts of the case. I'm curious what your father thought of the story. I think writing about family is always a dicey proposition, and you take risks, and not everything is flattering. How was that experience?
He told me it made him extremely emotional, and it was really scary to share it with him. Actually, just to take this intimate moment. And a lot of the piece is how we didn't talk about my experience of an eating disorder, and I think so many families don't talk about mental illness while they're in it, and sometimes even while they're out of it. But I think having that distance and knowing that I've been recovered for some time, it was almost cathartic, for the both of us, just to let that memory breathe and then kind of let it go. And giving it to Bellevue is for me almost a way of letting it go, which feels really great.
Did you ever think about writing fiction about the experience?
Yes, I've tried to write fiction about my eating disorder multiple times. It's been challenging, but I'm currently working on a novel that focuses on a protagonist who has kind of a developing eating disorder. And it's been nice because she's become more and more her own person, and she's no longer in my control anymore, which I think is always the sign of a healthy novel with its own ecosystem, its own characters. But I think I had to write this as nonfiction. I think writing as a poem first, as fictional first, it felt like a way for me to try and enter the memory in a way that was safer and maybe more poetic. But I knew I had to get just into the heart of it and rip myself open a little bit. And it feels good to have it out there.
In the fictional character with eating disorder, do you find you're exploring other aspects that you weren't able to do with nonfiction?
Yeah, I'm focusing a lot in that story about the queer experience with an eating disorder, and it's not something I touched on my piece, but I think about a lot now my status as a bisexual person and how that intersected with my eating disorder and my perception of the female body. And it's obviously not something I reflected on when I was 16 or 17. You know, I wasn't even out to myself. But it's nice to be able to explore that in a fictional space, kind of knowing things about the character that I wish I knew then.
Right. It's interesting to talk about coming out. I think in some ways, publishing a piece of writing is a coming out. You're bringing things that are very interior. And we talk a lot about, and there are many things we write that never get published. But then the decision to publish is a coming out. That how was that experience for you?
It's terrifying at first. I shared this piece with several friends before sending it out into the world, just to make sure that it made sense, that it was coherent, and its iterations have changed so much over the years. You know, first it was really about my dad, and now it's transformed into something, more about the medical industry. But I think I knew that I was ready because it's a story I've talked to with the closest people in my life. It's something I've told them about. And when people ask me to help them understand what it's like to have an eating disorder, this is the moment I return to because it was so surreal in a terrifying way. And I think that so often there's writing about eating disorders and it doesn't focus on the fact that it's really scary and there's a sense of real horror to it. So this is the moment I share with the closest people in my life. And it felt like the moment I had to share on the page and get out there.
One of the things that nonfiction writers are often frustrated by is you can't be as, quote, creative as you can in fiction and poetry. But one of the things I try to argue is that you actually can be. I think you've demonstrated that because you can shift the frame, the narrative, the flash forward, the flashback, all while being faithful to the truth. But there are many ways to be creative. And certainly we read many stories about eating disorders, particularly nonfiction, at BLR. And yours really stood out because of the way that it was more creative with that. Or it really dealt with it in a way that explored some of the emotions without being hallmarky. That's an easy place for these things to go. And this managed to stay on just that side. And I'm wondering if you could mention some of your influences, either writers, poets, who you look to when you're trying to write.
Yeah, one of my favorite influences for eating disorders is actually graphic memoir and graphic novels. So there's an amazing book, Lighter Than My Shadow, How I Made It to 18. I love seeing eating disorders rendered visually because I think it's an experience that really is visual, not only for the person experiencing the eating disorder, but in the way other people interact with them and comment on their body, and it becomes a subject of debate. So I think anyone writing about the body should visit graphic memoir and graphic literature. But there's so many writers I admire whose bodies are central to their work. Like Lydia Yuknovich is my idol for all intents and purposes. And Kiese Lehman, his recent book was just absolutely incredible. And I'm very excited how many people are writing about their bodies and making it its own character, because that's how my body felt when I was experiencing my eating disorder.
I wonder if you'd comment on the parallel of having your writing critiqued with having one's body critiqued, either by the medical profession or society.
Yeah, I actually think writing is so therapeutic, to kind of distinguish types of critique, because when your body is being critiqued and kind of examined, it feels like there's nothing you can do to change it. Or like I did, I changed it too violently, and there were repercussions there. But a piece of writing, it feels like something that you can start anew. There's no rules, there's no boundaries. There's obviously moments of pain when you get that feedback to a piece, but it doesn't feel like it's its own living organism until it's done, until you've built the skeletal structure around it. So I think having that flexibility on the page is actually a really great way for rigid thinkers who might have that issue with eating disorders to flex their brains and to get away from that mental trap that can happen.
Right. Well, was it hard to get critiques on when you wrote about this very tender moment, when you got critiques from the various editors here or other people? Was that hard to assimilate?
It was difficult at first, but I think that I've been sitting on this piece for so long that I knew I had to look at it with different eyes. And, just having other people comment on it and provide some revision, I think it helped make it sharper. And certainly, like you said, I think writing about eating disorders can be very melodramatic. I think it tends that way just with the subject matter. So I think having that third person just check and read it with fresh eyes is always so helpful. So I enjoyed the process.
What are you working on now? The novel, anything else?
Yeah, the novel is the main focus. There's, of course, a secondary novel that I'm trying to quiet and tell, like, hold on, we're a little busy right now. But the current novel, I'm hoping that it'll be a speculative coming-of-age story. I'm very inspired by speculative writers like Carmen Maria Machado and everything she's doing right now. I hope it's weird. I hope it's queer. And I hope it's fun. So that's the goal.
Well, that sounds like a wonderful goal. Thank you so much, Amy Blakemore. We appreciate your time.
Thank you, Danielle. My anorexia went by different names: perfectionist, prude, anxious, introverted, bitch, skinny bitch, wants boys to like her, wants boys not to like her, overly sensitive, infected, sick, riddled with a parasite. But we were only able to draw blood for the last one, so we did. My father drove me to the appointment where we would determine what to do with the tapeworm in my stomach, the one that, in all likelihood, was not real. I'd be lying if I told you I remember what we talked about on the way there. I don't. I didn't talk much during high school, unless talking was staying up late on Instant Messenger, flirting with boys with acne who said, "Sup." In the car, I pressed my face to the window, let the sun warm my skin. I was always trying in those little ways to feel pretty. It was spring, and I wanted to sprawl on the grass beside our house. Besides, I didn't think I was sick or anorexic or not eating enough. I thought I was dieting like everyone else. And after a while, eating less felt comfortable, normal, safe. The less I ate, the less I wanted, until my body became less. There was nothing bold or bright or celebrity about my eating disorder. I hardly noticed it myself until my thinness migrated from admirable to somewhat concerning to red alert waist of a girl. These shifts occurred quickly, seemingly overnight. And I could explain none of it. I couldn't explain any of my desires or behaviors in a way that made sense. I was starving myself, and I didn't know why. It took a while for my family to admit that anything was wrong. There were fights at the top of the stairwell. Are you doing this for attention? There were family dinners where everyone stared at me picking from my plate but said nothing. There were words like withdrawn, thin, sick, and then tapeworm. We repeated that one. Tapeworm. Practically unheard of in our native New England or in the country at all, the CDC reports that fewer than 1,000 people are infected in the United States a year. But the idea that something had taken a hold of me from the inside was too compelling and too convenient. If proven correct, it would mean that none of this was my fault. It would mean that we could extract the intruder and leave the daughter intact. The horror of the experience would be followed by divine redemption, cleanness. But mental illness can't be scraped out.